Welcome to another episode of Life Lessons with Dr. Bob, where you'll hear highly accomplished and fascinating guests talk about the challenges they've overcome and the winning mindsets that have led them to great success. And now your host, Dr. Bob.
Welcome to another episode of Life Lessons with Dr. Bob, during which we have discussions with very interesting people, and the goal is to let's hear what they have to say about their career and the things they did, the positive things, the ups, the downs, the sideways of their path to success. And tonight we have a rather interesting guest. It's a Special Agent Mark Vespucci, who is a Special Agent with the Criminal Investigation Division of the IRS. I'm going to read to you a little bit about his background, and then we'll let him go with his stories. He graduated Northeastern University with a degree in accounting, and after graduation, he spent a number of years in public accounting at PricewaterhouseCoopers. Given his lifelong interest in fighting crime and with his strong background in both computer and forensic accounting, Mark joined the U.S. Justice Department, where he was assigned to the Criminal Division of the Internal Revenue Service. He became a special agent there, and has spent the last 20 years as a computer forensic examiner with the responsibility of locating, seizing, processing, and reporting on the contents of computers, cell phones, and other electronics that were seized during search warrants. With his over 20 years of investigating crime, some involving very, very large dollar amounts, he has a lot of fascinating stories to tell us. So, Mark, let's hear some of them.
Thanks, Dr. Bob. Appreciate being here. You know, one of the things I wanted to say before we start out is that, everything we talk about today has been, adjudicated through the court system. So we're not revealing any of our trade secrets. We're not revealing anything, and we're not discussing any ongoing investigations that haven't been completely, worked their way through the court system.
Good,
so,
understood.
Yeah, okay.
Good. But you're going to put a lot of color behind these
I
stories.
hope to, yeah. I hope
even
to
if they were
color,
in the newspapers and TV,
right.
You'll put all those fragments together. And
I hope so.
Yeah,
and
good.
I think that, interestingly enough, what happens behind the scenes, during an investigation, the crafting of an investigation really sometimes can become very artistic, right? A lot of times people think there is a methodology of going through an investigation, but at the same time, there's a lot of leeway and there's a lot of things that can happen working with the U.S. Attorney's Office and the investigators on the ground. And, where do we want to be? Do we want to be covert now? When can we be overt? What about witnesses? What witnesses do we think might cooperate? What witnesses do we think are not friendly to us? And those are all things that need to be evaluated and looked at. And so, we don't just go out, especially in the IRS, criminal investigation of the IRS. When we show up at the door, we're not looking for somebody to pay a bill. Mm-hmm. Generally someone's going to prison, and it becomes incumbent upon us to make sure that we do a really, really good job, that we look under every stone, that we make sure that we're doing an investigation in the appropriate way so that we aren't, besmirching someone's, reputation. Because the reality is that when the IRS Criminal Investigation Division of the Treasury gets involved, very few businesses survive. Mm-hmm. And so it's important for us to make sure that we're doing the right thing for the right reasons and not just going out and, taking people down because we can.
So give us some examples of recent cases that you've been instrumental in solving.
One of the most recent ones, and I think was very, very large dollar amounts, we're talking in the billions of dollars, was a case that was worked out of Salt Lake City, Utah. And the family that was involved is called the Kingston family. Sometimes they're called the Davis County Cooperative, but it's a very large polygamous organization that lives and works in the Salt Lake City Valley. And as part of their modus operandi, they own and operate hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of businesses: cattle farms, coal mines, auto parts stores, to all sorts of different businesses, all legally. Everything is what they're doing is legal, but some of the things that they do are illegal. There's been a lot of welfare type fraud situations that happen. There's Obviously it's a polygamist group. It's a polygamist organization. There are, men with many wives and whatnot that are happening. And there's even a television show, on one called Escaping Polygamy, that focuses on this particular group. One of the things that they recently were involved in, though, was the largest biofuel fraud that has ever been investigated and taken down in the United States.
And give me some background. What are biofuels, and how does the government get involved in biofuels?
So in 2005, George W. Bush created a renewable energy program. And the program didn't actually get officially launched until, I think, late 2007, 2008. But the idea is that the federal government wanted to incentivize the production, use, and blending of renewable fuels from renewable sources, such as used cooking oil and other, non-fossil fuels, and have those fuels generated and then blended into real fuel, to fossil fuels.
So you'd go to major restaurant chains or something and buy all the old oil or collect all the old oil. And the concept was the government wants to incentivize that.
The government.
So it'll pay companies for picking up that oil and reprocessing it.
Not just reprocessing it, but also creating and making it into ethanol, making it into a biofuel. And in doing so, the government needed to incentivize that, right? They wanted people to do it. And so they created a program called the REP, Renewable Energy Program. And they created a situation whereby they allowed and wanted people to create gallons, millions of gallons of this that they then be blended into other fuels. As part of doing that, they essentially created a commodity, right? They created this commodity, and then they incentivized it by saying that if you are a fossil fuel producer and you're not producing renewable fuels, you have to purchase credits that are generated by people that are producing renewable fuels, right?
So it's a tax on people who are producing fossil fuels.
Correct, right. And the incentive is if you decide that you want to get into the biofuel manufacturing business, the incentive is twofold. Number one, for every batch or every gallon of biofuel that you generate a RIN credit, a renewable identification number. That RIN number is associated with a particular gallon of fuel that you produced, right? That RIN can be used in a couple of different ways, but one way it can be used is it can be traded to a person that's manufacturing non-renewable fuel, because they're required to either produce them or buy them.
I see.
Okay. The other way is that you can, as a biofuel manufacturer, you also receive a $1 per gallon credit from the IRS for every gallon you produce.
A credit applied to the income tax you owe, or a credit actually dollars?
A dollar credit for every gallon. So if you produce 300 million gallons of biofuel in a quarter, you're going to get a check for $300 million.
And that check comes from the government, or it comes from the people who bought those credits?
It comes directly from the IRS.
Right, so the companies that are producing fossil fuels, they would purchase the credits from the government.
Correct.
I see. And then the government gives that money, or pays the producers of the biofuels $1 per gallon.
Per gallon, in addition to the value of the actual RIN credit that was generated. That gets traded on the market. So what ends up happening in the Kingston case, which is interesting, they generated, Jacob Kingston was the president and CEO of Washakie Renewable Energy that operated in Salt Lake City. And they operated for a number of years fairly successfully without producing much fuel, but it takes some time and it takes some capital to get those businesses off the ground. They opened and operated a plant in Plymouth, Utah, which is in the northern part of Utah. And they were mildly successful. They never produced much biofuel, but they realized very quickly that they didn't really need to produce much biofuel. They could produce the paperwork that showed that they were producing biofuel, send that information through the EPA, who was responsible for monitoring those programs, right? And then when the EPA certified that, yes, this is okay, we'll just go ahead and we'll submit our paperwork to the IRS and be given these credits.
So the IRS depended on the EPA to do the due diligence,
the due diligence and to create an audit trail and make sure that things were happening. Shortly, it became very obvious that they could be a lot more profitable by just showing that they were making this fuel without actually doing it. But they needed to create the infrastructure behind it. So we were talking about rail cars. They had to build a railway. They purchased rail cars. They purchased trucks to make it look like they were doing a rounding operation of, purchasing feedstock fuel, right, in California, and then shipping it through Las Vegas and up to Utah, and that it was going to be processed into biofuels, and then it was going to be manufactured. Then those RIN credits would be applied to those fuels. Those RIN credits could then be sold or traded, and then they could apply for $1 per gallon credit for every gallon of fuel that they manufactured. The IRS gets involved in this because it goes quickly from a situation where they're maybe getting checks for $10 to $12 to $15 million a quarter, to
which is sizable,
which is
itself.
A sizable amount of money, right? To they're filing for refund checks for the credit for the $1 per gallon credit in the hundreds of millions of dollars. Okay, that's going to draw some attention, and when the IRS ended up getting involved, the operation had gotten to the scale where the last credit they applied for was over $300 million in credits for one quarter. And that is going to draw a significant amount of attention.
And you actually, the IRS actually sent checks or wired that kind of money.
There were paper checks.
Paper
$180 million per check.
Per check. And you've seen those checks?
I've seen those checks. Yeah, it's pretty surprising. And I think what's even more surprising is the fact that had this organization not gotten so greedy, this Kingston organization not gotten so greedy, it probably would have not been something that would have come on the radar very quickly. It may have even still been going on to this day. And when we got involved, one of the things that we learned was that the organization had supersized its ability to do this when they got involved with an Armenian named Levon Tremenzian. Levon Tremenzian has been found guilty back in February of 2020 of a number of federal crimes and is in prison now awaiting sentencing. The Kingstons that were involved in this case, Jacob Kingston, his brother Isaiah Kingston, his mother, and his wife have all been indicted, and they've all pled guilty, and will be sentenced probably to anywhere between 15 and 30 years each. That's what they've agreed to in their sentencings. They've all yet to be sentenced. But what was really surprising about this was
they're in jail.
They only Levon and Jacob are in jail right now. The mother, the wife, and the brother are released on their personal recognizance pending sentencing. There's a number of children involved in these families. You can imagine with.
And what about the money? Did the IRS go and seize the money?
The money was an interesting aspect. I think it was around $521 million of physical money went out the door to the Kingston organization.
More than $500 million.
More than $500 million
to this organization.
Correct.
To this criminal organization.
And the assets that were purchased were Bugatti Veyrons and chrome Lamborghinis. A $3.5 million mansion in Sandy, Utah. All of those things, with the exception of the Veyron, I don't believe the IRS was ever able to locate that. A very large yacht. We're talking international money laundering through Turkish banks, through Belizean entities, through other locations. There were implications and allegations and arrests of bribing of federal law enforcement officers through this Armenian organized criminal enterprise. All of these things were taken apart by the IRS and the Criminal Division of the IRS with some assistance from the EPA and the Department of Defense as well. There was probably anywhere from, we estimate that it was an additional $600 million that was attempted to be taken. So they had applied for an additional $600 million of credits that IRS CI suspended prior to the civil side of the IRS actually mailing those checks out and being cashed. And so, we stopped roughly $600 million, but then there's also the aspect of the money laundering piece of that. So when you launder those proceeds into different various accounts, every time you layer that money, that's an additional money laundering charge. So if I move $1 million into one account in a layering operation, and then I move it to another account, well, there's $2 million. It's the same million, but the way the federal
charge,
it's another charge. And so in this particular instance, the money laundering charges and the international money laundering charges were over $3 billion of laundered proceeds. And there were yachts involved, there were cars, properties in Huntington Beach, California, properties in Europe, properties in Utah. There were properties all over the place, and it was really the concerted effort of many investigators to take this apart and make sure that we were doing what we needed to do to not only shut this down, the abuse of this particular industry down, but also to try to save the taxpayers some money out of this.
Right, and also hopefully they changed the method of checking to ensure that people were earning these credits before the checks go out.
Yeah,
there was obviously loopholes in the system that these smart guys took advantage.
They took advantage of it, and unfortunately, what's also happening right now is that the incentive to generate these RINs, right, these credits, is still there, but what's happened also is just like a commodity market works. When the scarcity of a commodity increases, the value of that commodity goes up. So it's now in a situation where RINs are now trading for 19 to 20 times more than they were trading for just a year ago. So the incentive for more abuse of this particular program is actually increasing, and it's now incumbent upon the EPA to make sure, in a partnership with the IRS, that these types of things don't happen. We have a very good roadmap on how to do this, on how to make sure that the manufacturers are doing what they need to do. The reality, though, is that manpower is short. And making sure that you're getting into these organizations and that you're not having, the wool pulled over your eyes and creating these fictitious documents for the purposes of just generating the credits. A
great idea that was kicked off by George W. Bush of incentivizing companies to reprocess biofuels turns into a nightmare. Not only for the taxpayers, but honestly a nightmare for the people that get caught up in it as well. I mean, when you pull $1 trillion through an industry, even if only 20% of that $1 trillion is fraudulent, that's a lot of money. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Now tell me, people with this kind of money that they've stolen, they can avoid capture and arrest. So how did you go about finding these people?
Yeah, that's interesting. Several of them were already U.S. citizens. And in the case of Jacob Kingston, the day that Jacob Kingston was arrested and I was on the team that arrested him, we actually arrested Jacob and his family as they were boarding a plane on their way to Turkey. So it was fairly easy to get him, and we actually approached him as he was stepping down the jetway, literally stepping down the jetway onto the threshold of the jetway to walk into the airplane, with the idea being, as the computer forensic examiner in this case, I wanted to get his phone in an unlocked state at the time so that it could be examined properly without having to rely on him to provide me with the PIN code. Unfortunately, he used a paper ticket and scanned in. He wasn't using the app on his phone, so that didn't work, but it didn't really matter because eventually Jacob cooperated. There are some other people in this particular case that were, we call it in the wind, right? They were more difficult to locate. One of them is a Turkish national, and he was over in Europe, and he's been accused of international money laundering, the international arm of this particular thing. His last name is Korkmaz, and he was difficult to find. He's a billionaire, and he was traveling all through Europe, and he was using multiple phones and really obfuscating his location and telling people he was in some locations and really not being there. And he was posting some pictures to social media accounts that we were looking at, and we were using FBI and other law enforcement resources to identify where he was, and they were fairly good at doing it. One of the things that I did with the IRS is that he was using WhatsApp very frequently, and we through some legal documentation and some legal requests through WhatsApp were able to capture on a live basis his IP address of where he was making posts on his WhatsApp and what phone calls, if he was using WhatsApp to make WhatsApp calls. And using that information and some things in the background and some cooperation from Interpol and from other law enforcement resources in Europe, it took about 3 weeks, but we tracked him down in Upper Bavaria, and he was arrested on June 13th or 14th, after 3 weeks of pretty intensive Every 8 hours, I would get a download from WhatsApp, and I'd have to go through this and try to figure out exactly where these IP addresses were. I would send that over to our counterparts in Interpol, and then they would do their work on the ground over there to track him down. And so he's now he's fighting extradition
from Turkey.
Well, no, he wants to go to Turkey because
they'll protect him.
He has friends in Turkey, and the argument that the Department of Justice is making, I don't know how successful it will be, is that he needs to face justice based upon the warrants that were issued out of the United States first, and then if Turkey wants to then prosecute separately for some other matter, then maybe they should. But the idea being that if you're first in line at the party, you should get first. You should get first.
And your agency did most of the work.
I would say we absolutely did the lion's share of the work on that. Yeah.
Now, I know over coffee this morning you mentioned there was something about a boat, a ship that you were able to identify.
Right.
So
yeah.
tell us that story.
Yeah. So through the process of the agents that were working on this particular case, through that process, they were able to identify and locate assets that were purchased, and we talked about some of them. One of the assets was an extremely large, I say boat. It was a yacht. It was a very large. I think it's 170 or 171 feet, and the boat is actually owned. There's some contention about who actually owns the boat, but the boat was named the Queen Anne, and it was named after the daughter of Lavan Tremenzian, who is the Armenian who is in prison right now, and he's responsible for the supersizing of this particular scheme. And the boat was eventually identified, and it was impounded by the U.S. government. I believe the Turkish government has it right now. And the idea is that we're attempting to physically seize that boat and get it into a sale. So if anybody's interested in purchasing a boat, Dr. Bob, you might be somebody. I think the purchase price right now is 14 million euro. I don't know how. I don't know the value in terms of boats, but from what I've learned about boats, the value
that's low.
That's low, right?
Right, and also it's low. Why? Because it's been sitting somewhere without getting any attention. I'm sure. But didn't you identify that boat somehow by the photographs of it?
Well, yeah, that's true. Yeah, so one of the things that we were able to do was there was a number of pictures that were taken of people on that boat
at different places.
At different
these
places.
Are prior photos.
Correct. Yeah, and so using that information as well as some testimony information, in addition to some cooperating witnesses that were communicating with the people that were kind of trying to sell the boat because they kind of wanted to get rid of the boat. We were able to sort of track down exactly where the boat was by making. The government sometimes can decide like, hey, we're going to be a purchaser. We have, it's no secret that we have undercover agents, right? And we wanted to purchase that boat. And so by doing so, we made some outreaches that made it look as if we were the ones that were looking to purchase that boat. And then
where was it?
At the time, I believe it was on the water when it happened, but it was in Italy. So it was being moved. It was being moved pretty frequently, but it was being moved from a port in Italy where the federal government finally was able to track it down and put their hooks into it. Yeah.
Fantastic. So your agency's efforts, and you played a huge part in this, saved the government perhaps $500 million, it sounds like.
Oh, saved it for sure. Yeah. No question. Over $500 million. But also, I believe right now, I think the government has we've recovered probably around 170 million.
But you stopped other money from going.
Stopped other money.
That was on the way out.
Yeah, there's an additional bank account in Turkey right now with roughly 110 million in it that the U.S. government has seized. We have not been successful in getting it, as far as I know, yet. But the money is frozen and it is seized. So, we're instrumental in seizing a lot of money. And one of the things that we're very involved in right now is also cryptocurrency. So that's something we can talk about later.
And all in all, from the time that you got started on this case, how long did it take?
So this case was actually started by an agent of the IRS he's left since then, and he's now working for the Department of Defense, Office of Inspector General. He started that case in, I believe, 2013. Yes. We made the arrest of Jacob Kingston in August of 2019.
Wow. 6 years.
Yes.
Well worth it, but it's very interesting because the common person thinks that they don't believe, they don't understand how long it takes to prosecute a complex case. You watch TV and you watch movies, and everything, of course, happens in 90 minutes or maybe 2 hours.
Right.
But a lot of work goes into this, and
a significant amount of work. And one of, I think, the biggest reasons and the takeaways from this is that we as investigators, we work specifically with the U.S. Attorney's Office, and we work really in conjunction, hand in hand with them. It's really important that we make sure that the investigation and that the work we're doing proceeds logically. It proceeds with some level of expediency, but not haphazardly, right? We understand, I understand that when I show up at someone's house, it's generally not a good day, right? And we want to make sure we're doing it, like I said before, the right thing for the right reason. At the same time, we don't want to just look the other way and walk the other way. Well, we're not sure. We don't think. We're not quite sure. Whatever it is, and we also don't want to unnecessarily, not necessarily inconvenient, but we don't want to unnecessarily look at, waste our time, I guess is the point. So, selecting the right cases and the worthiest adversaries or the worthiest targets is really an important thing. And here's the interesting thing is I don't personally do that. That's something that we are assigned cases sometimes, but we generate and develop a criminal investigation, and then we bring it to the U.S. Attorney's Office, who then has to agree, right? And frankly, they don't always agree. They say, look, we also have limited resources. So, yes, this is an important case, but is it the most important case, right? We have some excess capacity over here in our white-collar crime unit. Do we think that there's white-collar crime involved here? If there is, let's move it over there. Maybe we can do it, right? So it's really a partnership, and it really is something that is almost like a dance sometimes. You really have to make sure that
it takes perseverance. That's very important.
Right. And also the using your political capital, right? Making sure that you're not wasting somebody else's time, because next time when you really need some help, they're going to say, well, we spent quite a bit of money and time on this, and we didn't get a lot out of it. Didn't go anywhere. So, your political capital becomes very important to you. And as you progress through your career, banking that political capital and making sure you have it is really what comes down to whether you can be successful or not.
Fantastic. But you're not only working on that one case, right?
No.
When you were working on that, there were other cases at the same time.
Yeah, other cases.
So that's not a full-time job. I mean, the whole thing is a full-time job.
Yeah.
So tell us about some other less complex stories.
Oh, geez. Trying to think. Let's see. One of a less complex story was one that was interesting. I worked a number of years ago up in Boston, and it was with the MBTA, the Transit Authority, and
that's a state organization.
That's a state-run organization, and
it runs the buses and the trolleys.
Yeah, right. Runs the buses, runs the trolleys, runs all those things, trains. But what's interesting is that, when we were working on that at the time, I mean, a lot of people still pay in cash. When you get on a bus, you pay, at the time, it was, 85 cents or $1 to get on a bus. And, there wasn't a lot of people do have some passes, but people still pay a lot in cash. And through a walk-in informant, a lady who walked into our office up in Boston and made an allegation or a complaint that, this lady that would come in, every Friday or every Saturday morning, and she'd spend $8,000 or $10,000 in cash.
Where? In retail stores?
Retail stores, very high-end retail stores in the downtown Boston area.
Some lady, a customer, would walk into these stores and spend $8,000-$10,000 on Saturday.
Every Saturday, yeah, and pull it out of a Gucci fanny pack that she was wearing, and there'd be a stack of $20 bills, and it would be shoes. She would buy Manolos and Blahniks, and a single pair of ladies' shoes for $750, or some cosmetics or some costume jewelry for $4,000 or $5,000, and as an investigator, when you're sitting across the table from somebody and you hear this, well, that's not that unusual. There are some pretty wealthy people out there. And when I asked her, I said, well...
Now, how did she become aware of this?
She was an employee at the store, and she became aware of it because one of her coworkers was bragging in the lunchroom because they all work on commission. Her friend was bragging in the lunchroom that he had made almost $80,000 in commissions off of this one particular
customer who comes in a year. 80 grand in commissions
in a year. Right. So she asked him, well, what does she do for work that she has that kind of money? And he says, oh, well, she works for the T. She works for the MBTA. And this lady thought, well, that doesn't make sense to me. How can somebody that works for the state government be spending $8,000 to $10,000 a week doing this? And
which is $500,000 a year, basically.
Right. And interestingly enough, that woman went to the FBI, and the FBI looked at her and said, we don't really get involved in that. Go over to the IRS, which was right across the street from us.
Wow.
From them at the time. And so, and I happened to be the person that was on the duty agent that day, and I took the information, and she provided.
She actually showed up. She just didn't call the IRS and
she
drop
physically
a dime.
Came to our office.
She came to the office.
Yes. What was more exciting for me was that she was doing it out of a sense of almost patriotism. She was a French national. Mm-hmm. She was on a work visa at the time. And she thought that there's something wrong here. There's something unusual about this woman who works for the state spending this kind of money. And she thought that someone needed to look at it. Mm-hmm. And after the interview, which was about a 40-minute interview with her, and I had her fill out the Form 211, which is a form that is filled out if someone provides the IRS with information about a fraud or a theft or a tax evasion or whatever it is. You fill out this form, and if the IRS recovers funds, you're actually entitled to up to a 10%.
Fantastic.
Good.
There should be incentive for coming forward.
So after the very first phone call I made was to a friend of mine he was a task force officer that was working at the FBI at the time, and he also was an MBTA detective. And his name was Pete Pachuco, and I called Pete, and I said, hey, I had to be very careful because I don't know really who this lady is. And it turns out her name is Mary Lempitsky, and she was the superintendent of revenue collection for the MBTA. If you think of it in terms of a timeline, Mary sat at timeline T0. She was the person that was responsible for determining on a daily basis how much cash the MBTA
was taking in. Yeah.
And when I called Pete, I said, hey, Pete, I've got a couple questions I wanted to ask you. I said, do you know a lady named Mary Lempitsky? And he said, oh, yeah, I know Mary. We all know. Everybody knows Mary. And I said, well, how long has she worked there? Oh, 20 years or more, maybe 25. Well, is she a friend of yours? Well, yeah, she's an acquaintance. I've been to her house a couple times for barbecues. And I said, well, and then I asked him where she worked, and he told me. And, I was almost floored right away. And I said, well, I need you to come down to my office. I got to talk to you. And we did. And, that investigation took about 1.5 years to do. The interesting part about that investigation is that the MBTA is even though you think of the transit authority of any city as a large organization, there's not that many people running it, right? There's a very few number of people.
A lot of bus drivers and train drivers.
But the people that are running it at the top, there's a small number of people. And many of them know each other. And in this particular situation,
you don't know who to trust.
You don't know and there are unions. There are unions involved, and there are lots of things involved in this particular case. And the most interesting thing about this case is that, from what I was able to determine, Mary learned this particular weakness through an audit report.
There was an audit report that most companies have. Auditors come in and they look at the process of handling cash or dispersing checks, and they sign off on it, or they'll say, here are some possible weaknesses.
Correct.
So in her case, she actually read that audit report. There was an audit report. It identified weaknesses.
Yes.
She didn't cure them. She took advantage of them.
She cured most of them, but the ones that were most lucrative and most beneficial, she took steps to make sure that she would be the person that was in the approval channel to make sure that, hey, yeah, we signed off on that and we made sure it was closed, but it wasn't closed.
All right, so tell us, how did she get her hands on all those quarters?
So that was a really interesting story. I ended up having to diagram this out when it was going to go to trial, and there was eventually a plea, but the diagram was amazing, and I'll abbreviate it, but here's how it happened. In 2003 or 4, right around there, the MBTA upped their fare from 85 cents to get on the bus to $1.
Now it's paper.
Now it's paper. Now the problem here is that when you get into a bus and you've got a dollar bill, you're still going to be able to get on the bus. So what people would do is they would take that dollar bill and they would fold it so it would be about the size of a quarter, maybe a little bit bigger, and they could stuff it into the change collecting on a bus or a train or whatever it was.
It's a locked box.
And it's a locked box.
Bus driver doesn't have the keys to.
Bus driver doesn't have the keys, but now what's happened is you now have dollar bills into a machine that wasn't meant to accept dollar bills, but it's okay.
Yeah.
It'll go in, right? Well, the problem is that the machine is also designed to count the coins that are in the tank that it goes into, but not the dollar bills. So now you have a dollar bill that has been entered into a revenue stream that is uncounted and unmonitored. The bus driver knows it's in there, but the authority doesn't know it's in there, the transit authority. And then they had their own fleet of trucks that would come and vacuum out that money and pull it into a tank. That tank would get delivered to Mary's facility, and then those tanks would be dumped onto conveyor belts. Now, here's the problem. The machines that are counting the coins also aren't able to count those dollar bills. They can't count it. So they would have pickers that would sit up on the line and pick those dollar bills off and throw them into clear trash bags, right? Those trash bags would get full, very full. Now, the issue is now that you've got a dollar bill that's folded maybe 8 times and has to be unfolded, flattened out, and then counted by hand. They didn't have the personnel to do that. And so what they did is they built a cage in their count facility, floor to ceiling, probably about the size of this room, and they would throw the trash bags into that room, lock it, and count it when they could. Here's the problem. That cash is still uncounted and unregistered. The transit authority has no idea that it exists, other than on paper, I threw a bag of money in there from this particular station. What they would do is on Saturdays, they would run an overtime shift for some people that wanted to come in, and they would hand that person one or two trash bags of cash. They would go to a count table. They would unfold them, flatten them out, make a stack of 100, take that stack of 100, make 10 stacks, get a stack of $1,001 bills, and then they would band that and put it into a metal pail. Now, if they didn't finish counting all of the bags they were assigned, they would take that metal pail with the counted money. Now, the money is now counted, but it's not registered with the authority yet. It's just written on a piece of paper.
Right, with the pail.
Dr. Shulman counted $4,000, $1 bills from the alewife station, okay? That now goes back into the cage for later processing by the vault manager. What Mary would do was she would go in, she would dismiss everybody on a Saturday. The deposit for Monday would already have been prepared on Saturday for the Monday's deposit to the bank. And that deposit was in a large rollable tank. You sometimes see them on casino floors.
Yes.
Big thing of tank money, right? That tank would be sealed. It would have a seal on it, and it would be in the vault. What Mary would do is everybody would leave for the day. She would then go into the technology room, and it was interesting how I had to figure this piece out. She would key card herself into the tech room. They had over 70 cameras in this facility. She would then pause, not stop, but she would pause the DVRs. Okay? She would pause the DVRs, and then she would go out into the vault. She would open up the vault. She would take out $8, $10, $12, $15,000 in 20s that had been counted. She would go into the cage and get the $4,000, $5,000, $6,000. She would get enough $1 bills that had been counted but not registered, and then put those into the deposit tank. She would then seal it, and the deposit would go on its way. Now, here's the interesting thing.
Well, why couldn't she have just taken it out of the cage, the money out of the cage?
Because it's in ones.
Oh, okay.
Right.
Okay.
So if I $10,000 in ones.
Yeah, it's hard to walk out with.
It's hard to walk out with 10,000 in ones, right?
Okay.
So the interesting piece about this is that from the aspect of the transit authority, the deposit is whole. The deposit is accurate, right? If it was a $250,000 deposit, it's still a $250,000 deposit.
But those were ones too that were being deposited from the vault, right? Weren't those ones?
No, there were ones that were in there. There were
Yes.
some ones that were in there, but mostly it was 5, 10s, 20s, 50s, and 100s.
And where did they get those?
People buy their monthly pass with a $50 bill or a $100 bill or a $20 bill.
So mainly it was higher denominations that were being sent to the bank.
It was almost all higher denominations that were being, and because when you buy a monthly pass, you don't necessarily, you could go to the window at South Station or North Station and you could hand over $80 in cash and get it, and they would put that in, and then that 80 would be picked up and then it would go to her facility. But it's not in ones, it's in 20s, 50s, whatever.
Okay.
But here's the interesting point was that part of the vault manager's responsibility is to create a denomination deposit breakdown.
How many fives?
How many
tens?
fives, how many tens to make up that $250,000. Well, she never changed that. She never changed that document. So what would happen is the bank would get the deposit on Monday. They would count it out, and they would do a denomination discrepancy report. And who would they send it to?
Her.
It would get faxed to her.
Oh, so they just didn't, the bank doesn't just count it and say, yes, the count is right. They actually sent back a report saying how many ones, fives, tens, and 20s.
Correct.
And there were too many ones in there.
There were a different number of ones. There was whatever, $8,000 and 20s.
Yeah, because she was taking out of the vault. She was taking higher denomination because it was easier to walk out of her office
Correct.
with that.
Yeah.
Right. But she replaced it with ones.
With unregistered but counted
Yes.
ones. And
That came from the cage.
That came from the cage.
Wow.
Right.
Very shrewd.
Very shrewd. And here's the thing. Even the amount of work that I ended up having to do to document how much money she was spending at all these different stores on Newbury Street, which is a very expensive street to shop on.
And she was always paying cash. She wasn't
always paying cash. I did not document Mary purchasing a single gallon of gasoline in 5 years on any credit card.
Yeah, because she had all this cash.
Right.
And she didn't want to put it in the bank because that would trigger
Exactly
an alert
right. I mean, she would rent a house on the Cape for $5,000 a week.
Right.
She would go to Turks and Caicos a couple times a year, and everything was paid for in cash. Interestingly enough, she had Mary was married at the time, but she also had a boyfriend who was a detective lieutenant who was also an MBTA police officer. It turns out that we were never able to prove that he had any knowledge of this. But
Of course he had knowledge. He knows what she makes for a living.
Right.
Her salary may have been 80 to 100 and a quarter or something, I'm guessing, back then. And she's spending all that kind of money.
Right, yeah.
Oh, wow.
yeah, so that was an interesting case, and it really set the stage for a very large, massive audit of the MBTA, a complete remake of the entire money count facility in Charlestown, Massachusetts. And in fact, what's ended up happening since then is they've had another money scandal at the Transit Authority. And just recently, I think in the last 2 years, it's been completely privatized. They have taken all of the MBTA no longer counts its own money because they've realized we just can't do this in an effective way. Let's just, we're going to pay whatever 15% of what they count that's what they're going to get, and we're done with this. We can't do this anymore.
And did that lady who was so patriotic or so honest, did she get a reward? She should have.
So it turns out that the way the reward system works is that it's what the government can recover. Right?
I see.
So Mary pled in this particular case. Mary pled guilty, and she was fined. It was very, very difficult for the Transit Authority to come up with a dollar figure of what was lost because they had no. I mean, basically, they relied on my calculations and what I was able to document.
And even it's lost, not recovered.
It's lost, not recovered. Correct.
Well, she should get a thank you note.
Well, we did. We brought her in, and we did. And I'm not sure exactly if she got money. I'm pretty sure she got some money, but I don't know exactly.
Well,
what it was.
that's a great story. But you happen to mention some other details that made your job more difficult. You tried to do a search warrant on her office. Tell us more about that, because it's hard for me to understand how the Justice Department or various aspects of it are examined so closely, and that some judges make your job harder.
Just very true. I have a lot of respect for judges in the Department of Justice and the justice system, but at the same time, it can sometimes feel like an adversarial relationship. And I'll give you an example. In that particular case, Mary was working in a facility that was owned by the state of Massachusetts. Like I mentioned before, they had over 70 cameras in that facility. And one of my requisite responsibilities in working with the Transit Authority, with a very small number of people on the inside that I could count on, was to get the recordings of those cameras and see if we had already captured potentially the theft on tape. And this was actually on VCR tape, believe it or not. So it was that long ago. And so one of my responsibilities was to go and look through thousands and thousands of hours of recorded tape. And there's no fast way to do that. You physically have to watch it almost in real time. I mean, you can fast forward,
yeah.
But that you're going to miss something, right?
Right.
So after many, many, many weeks, months of looking at tape and seeing that, okay, first of all, the executive complex of the Transit Authority is not an area that's covered on videotape, which is maybe by design. I don't know. Maybe it was an oversight. Her office is not something that was covered, right? The count facility itself, many of those things were covered. We never saw it. And so we made a petition through the U.S. Attorney's Office.
But did you notice there was a gap in time, or this is before there were digital video recorders, which put a timestamp on the screen as you're watching it, and she paused it so you...
That was only after yes. And so what I was able to figure out was that I was watching a video one day and I noticed that the time index had jumped. Yeah. I noticed that and I said, that seems fairly strange. It was around a 15-minute jump that I saw it, and I just happened to be looking at it when I noticed it, and then I identified a pattern of it happening on Saturdays. And then I requested from the Transit Authority the key logs of who's accessing this particular room. So what we wanted to do was put a camera into Mary's office there, because we made a determination that it was unlikely that we were ever going to capture who was doing this on camera. Because
on those cameras,
yeah. Right? Because that person knows the cameras are there, and and that person, if it is Mary, we didn't know 100%. We were fairly sure at the time it was her, that someone is pausing those cameras. So we, through the U.S. Attorney's Office, I wrote an affidavit and showed probable cause that I had looked at thousands of hours of video, was unable to make a determination as to who was stealing this money. And we think that it's this person. And here's why we think it's this person. You know, I had documented thousands of dollars in cash spending at Neiman Marcus and other stores and whatnot. And you know, this person didn't have a source of cash income, right? So how are you spending this amount of cash when you don't have any cash income and you're not making cash withdrawals from the bank? So I've documented all that. And a particular judge...
This is to get a search warrant.
This was to get a search warrant authorization to put a camera hidden in her office. So
her office, which the state or the government owns. It's
Correct.
Not her own home or something like that.
Right. It's
a government facility.
It is owned by the state of Massachusetts.
Yeah.
Interestingly enough, as a partner investigator with me, which was another, he's retired now, his name was Bobby Lenihan. He was really furious about this. He says, Mark, I can put a camera in any facility I want. I am number 4 in charge at the MBTA. I can put a camera wherever I want. And I said, well, turns out you can if a federal judge says you can't. And that's exactly what ended up happening. Was a federal judge told us that I don't find sufficient cause that you've looked at every other avenue to make a determination whether or not this theft is occurring outside of this woman's office. And the AUSA, who happened to be a woman, the assistant U.S. attorney, who happened to be a woman, Emily, she said to the judge, well, Your Honor, we've documented fairly thoroughly that my agent here has looked at thousands and thousands of hours of video and also looked at a key card access control log. He has looked at other things that indicate that something is happening, some adulteration is happening with the video. So we think that we've sufficiently proved it. And this particular judge denied the motion with the commentary saying that I don't know what you do in your office, Emily, but I know what I do in mine, and I certainly wouldn't want the government having a camera in there. And the assistant U.S. attorney at the time responded back, well, Your Honor, with all due respect, you're not stealing millions of dollars from the taxpayers of Massachusetts. And so
big difference.
It's a big difference, right?
Difference.
The interesting thing about it is that she dismissed it with prejudice, which means don't bring this back to me. I don't want to see this again. And as part of that, she also was able to, force us into other investigative methods that took significant amount more time for us to sort of unravel.
Made your case more difficult.
Right. It made the puzzle larger,
right,
and it made it more difficult for us to try to do what we needed to do to.
Now, I'm just wondering, couldn't your partner, who was working, he was an employee of the MBTA in a law enforcement capacity, couldn't he have just put the cameras there? Wouldn't if he had the right? I mean, sometimes it's easier to get absolution than permission.
Yeah, forgiveness than permission. So,
because clearly all those other 50 or something cameras, nobody got a warrant to put those up.
Right. Well, those were already existing, though.
They're already existing.
They were already existing. And so the idea behind...
So if he did this without asking, it could have tainted the case.
It could have tainted the case. We may not have been able to use the evidence gathered from it. Now, you might have been able to gather leads from it, right? Mm-hmm. But we would not have been able to use... potentially in a defense situation, right? So it becomes, he did the right thing by not doing it. It just made it more difficult for us. But at the same time, that's part of the perseverance aspect of this particular job, is making sure that, just because someone puts up a roadblock or a hurdle here or there, you just figure out a way to go under it or around it or whatever, right, without violating the law. And that's something that, sometimes becomes frustrating for us. But at the same time, I understand that there are reasons why. Generally, people have what's called a reasonable expectation of privacy in an office with a door that's locked and closed.
Mm-hmm. And that's reasonable, unless there's a documented reason to put it there.
That's the idea behind having probable cause,
right?
And then demonstrating that information to a judge, so that a judge can then say, yeah, I think that you do have probable cause, or I don't think you have enough, and I think you should do these 4 other things or whatever.
Okay.
But in a situation,
she said with prejudice, so you can't bring it back.
Don't bring it back here.
What kind of judge is that?
She ended up becoming the head of the sentencing commission. So it was she was a judge that was pretty highly respected by her peers and by Barack Obama at the time, who then appointed her as
I see.
A member of the sentencing
commission. What a
commission.
fantastic story. And when this informant, this lady who came forward, you could have said, well, you took some notes and said, well, I'm not going to look into it. It would be very easy for an investigator, just like the FBI said, it's not our business. You could have said, well, this caused more work for you, things for you to do. And this is what makes you successful. That you grab this, you didn't see it as extra work. You saw this as an opportunity to solve a crime.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
And I so much admire that, and I hope I don't know that other people in your line of work also take that with that positive attitude. It's not trying to minimize what you do every day; it's trying to maximize what you do every day.
Having I think having healthy skepticism is important, especially I'm a trained auditor, right? So I'm a skeptic to begin with, right? Mm-hmm. But also, curiosity is really something that lends its way into making sure that you're a good investigator, because it's very easy to, like you said, to walk away and say, that's going to be a lot more work, or this judge doesn't seem to really be interested in this. But when I look at, and I don't generally use the word targets, but I look at an investigation or a subject of an investigation is this worthy or not, right? Is this worthy of my attention? And sometimes it's not. I'll be honest. Sometimes they're not. Sometimes you get a person that gives you information and you really look at it and you say, this person really has some problems, or maybe there's some mental issues going on here.
Or they're trying to get somebody in trouble.
Right, exactly. There's retribution, retaliation, there's misdirection going on. And that's why it's really important for us to do our homework and make sure that we're like I said, we're taking the right case for the right reason, and not simply just, taking the things that interest us or not, right? Mm-hmm. Those cases that I just mentioned, I certainly wasn't the only one that worked on those cases, and we work in teams, right? And it's important. But also at the same time, that curiosity of knowing and wanting to find out what the truth is. And sometimes the truth is really that there's nothing there, right? We just don't know. We don't work every single case to the end. Not everything returns an indictment. Not everybody goes to jail, right? Mm-hmm. But it's important to actually see it through and make sure that you're doing a thorough job and taking ownership of what you're doing, right? Mm-hmm. Making sure that that the work that you're producing is something that is defensible in court, that it can be used, that it can be attacked and defended in a way that is legally sufficient, and that can be challenging.
Tell us one more.
So I think one of the most timely ones that we can talk about is cases that involve COVID relief, and in the middle part of 2020, the federal government stepped in and decided to make a program and funded it with a lot of money.
A lot meaning?
Billions of dollars, over $1 trillion, essentially, to help allay some of the losses of income that people were having related to businesses and industries being shut down. And two of them are the PPP, which is the Paycheck Protection Program, and then other ones are it's a COVID loan program, essentially, is that you could take out loans.
I never heard of that.
Yeah. So it was a way that the federal government allowed businesses structured in a certain way to make and to take out loans for capital improvement or other things, in addition to protect the paychecks of employees that weren't working anymore, right? So these are employees that can't come into work for whatever reason. They got COVID for 2 weeks, or they were caring for somebody that had COVID or whatnot. And so the federal government stepped in with this money that does not need to be paid back.
So it's a loan, but it doesn't have to be paid back.
It's a forgivable loan that never needs to be paid back.
So it's a gift.
And the income is not taxable.
Whoa.
Okay.
Wow, what could be better? And again, the goal is a wonderful goal. Programs always have very, very altruistic goals. The goal was to help businesses
and employees.
Help businesses help their employees.
Correct.
To pay their employees who weren't showing up.
Right. Yeah.
Because
for various
of COVID.
reasons.
Yeah.
For various reasons. So what we've seen happen is there's been a massive amount of fraud on these programs, and the victims of this fraud are essentially the people that couldn't get in time to get the money, because essentially eventually the money ran out, right? So if you weren't fast enough to the plate, you got shut out. So what we saw were CPA firms, some mid-level and lower-level CPA firms with a few, and we've done many search warrants, some recently in Utah. Across the country, we've seen a lot of guilty pleas from people. So what essentially happens is a CPA firm approaches a person who might be a door-to-door salesperson, selling pest control, selling windows, selling whatever. One employee, basically a sole proprietor, who just basically files a return as a sole proprietorship.
Which would not be eligible for this program.
Would not be eligible.
I get it.
So what happens is they come to these people and they say, hey, listen, we can help you out. Did you know you could get free money from the government? Well, how can I do that? Well, we can help you if we restructure your business as a C Corp or as an LLC or as an LLP, depending upon what we want to do in the state that we're in. You can be eligible for up to $15,000 to $30,000, right, of free money to help you get through this process. And the questions, it was very interesting. And a search warrant that we recently did, they were recording all of their phone calls. That we ended up seizing all these phone calls. And so we're going through and listening to these calls now, and the script that was being used and the sort of the lies that were being told, and what these employees, what these companies were being told to say was to maximize the amount of money that they could get from the government. How many employees do you have? Well, I don't really have any employees. It's just me. Well, you're married, right? You have children, right? Do you give a vacation? Do you pay vacation? Does your wife take sick time? Well, she doesn't work for me though. Oh, well, but she makes your lunch, right? I mean, and she provides you moral support, right? Well, yeah. Okay. So she kind of is an employee, right? Because if you have another employee, that's an additional $15,000 that you can get for that person, right?
I see. So they were leading them on with these discussions.
Correct.
And they were recording them.
They were recording. Some of them were. The ones that I was recently involved in, they were recording it. And what's even more interesting about that is that the people that the agents go out and interview, I would say they're the victims essentially, but these people that got the loans, they have what's called a reliance defense, right? They were relying on the expertise of a certified public accountant or a firm to say, hey, you're entitled to this, and here's the paperwork you need to do. We sent in some undercovers, some undercover agents that, did the same thing and kind of pushed the issue. Like, are you sure this is legal? I mean, this doesn't sound like, don't worry about it. We do this all the time. This is not a big deal. You're going to get this money. And the reality is that it was, like I said, a lot of people got shut out of this. A lot of people that really needed the help.
Legitimate businesses got shut out because the money was gone to these criminals.
Right. And here's
and how did the criminals make money? They took a percentage.
They take a percentage. So if they say they're going to get you, $15,000, of course there's an application fee, right? So we're going to charge you a $950 application fee, plus we're going to take 10% of what you get, because we've brought this to your attention and we've given you the program.
But the checks go to the individual business owner or the person.
Yes.
And they would rely on that guy to kick back.
To pay back. Yeah. So what they would generally do is take a credit card number over the phone. From what I've been hearing. They'll take a credit card over the phone, and then that money gets pushed into the account. So, those are programs, like I said, that are designed to help people that really need it. And unfortunately, an unscrupulous group of people or whoever, when you drag that much money through the economy, like I said, even 10 or 20% of it is fraudulent, someone's going to feed off of it.
Wow.
And it just goes away.
Oh, very unsettling. Now, how did the IRS get involved in this? How did you hear about it? I wouldn't have even thought about it.
Yeah. We heard about it very early on because of the service centers, the IRS service centers on the civil side. They have various types of algorithms and things that they run in the background for all these returns that were coming in. Unfortunately, the IRS has taken a lot of hits in terms of its budget, in terms of its staffing, and these people that generally probably would have seen this quicker and faster weren't able to. They didn't see it, and so these were algorithms that were running, and they said, "Hey, we're seeing a very large number of applications coming in from the Dr. Bob's CPA firm, and these applications all have the exact same number of hours that are lost. They're all 2 employees. They've all recently converted to LLCs or LLPs in the last 3 months.
Wonderful.
And so when you start to see those types of trends, it's a trend analysis, right? You look at it, and then you develop a lead. So the civil side develops a lead, and they send that over to the criminal side. And then our agents, we get together, we go out and we look at it. We do surveillances. We go and interview these people, and we say, well, how did you find this particular CPA firm? Did they find you? Did you find them? What was promised? How much did you pay? How did you pay?
But it seems that in the process, these small companies, small businesses, we'll call them, had to apply something to the IRS. That's how the IRS Civil Division heard about it. Well, there was some paperwork.
Yeah, but that gets done by the CPA firm.
Oh, the CPA.
CPA firm.
But as part of the process, paperwork had to go somewhere to the IRS.
Well, almost 90% of the time it was an electronic filing of some sort.
I understand. Yeah. I meant that. Okay, sure.
So some type of electronic filing goes to the IRS in the form, I don't remember the exact form number for the COVID relief and the PPP plan.
And AI algorithms probably running in the background found this.
Correct. They find it, and then they bring it to someone's attention, who then goes out and looks at it and does the groundwork. I mean, as much as we like to rely on automation, and I know you love automation. At some point, someone needs to go knock on the door and find out what's going on.
What's really going on.
And one of the real things that I think is the next thing that I see, at least coming down the pipe on this, is a massive amount of fraud in the child tax credit that's happening right now. We're going to see, and we're seeing it already, a huge increase in identity theft of children because the federal government is now advancing child tax credits every month, rather than making you wait until the end of the year and you file your return and you get an additional child tax credit. They're now doing it every month. And so the quicker you can get or steal an identity of a minor who's under 18 years old and get that in, you're going to start receiving money every month from the federal government in advance of your child tax credit.
Prior to filing your tax form,
Correct.
You're going to get from the government based on the prior year's tax.
Correct.
Probably. They say you have 5 kids, here's money, and it's going to come every month.
Correct. Correct.
Incredible.
Yeah.
Incredible.
So, those, the unintended consequences are really, the idea behind it is, hey, this will be good. We'll get money to the people and the families that need it, and they can spend it on, their children. But the reality is that, like I said, even a small number of people,
20%.
And the sad part is that you don't necessarily know that the identity of your child is stolen yet until you go to file your return, and your return gets rejected because the IRS says, well, it turns out somebody already filed a return on your behalf, with that social security number and child's name on it. Wow. And here's the craziest thing about that is, let's say you went into a service center and that happened to you, and you said, my child, I can't file my return. My return says that this is rejected because my child has already been added to another return. I want to know whose return my child is on. The IRS will tell you, I can't tell you that because that's a disclosure violation. You've already told me that that's not your return. I can't tell you whose return your child is on because it's not your return.
But more importantly, I want it on my return,
right.
And
it's very difficult. You then have to get what's called an ITIN number. You have to file an affidavit. All these different things, and it becomes very difficult. So what I would say is, make sure you're keeping track of who has access to, your children's information, including their schools. Schools are probably the primary source of PII, personally identifiable information from a children, because a lot of people don't know this, but if you are a child and you're taking part in any sort of school lunch program, reduced lunch, free lunch, or whatever, the Department of Agriculture requires that you provide that information to the school so that the school can provide it to the federal government, and the federal government can actually keep track of who's getting what. But if you have an unscrupulous person that's working in the school system that has
those systems they're not very sophisticated.
You plug in a thumb drive.
Right.
To a computer, and you download 5,000 names of children
and serial numbers,
and social security numbers. You could take that to the dark web, sell it. You could block it into 500 names in SSNs at a time, and sell it for $8,000 for 500 names, because they know they can produce that, use that information, and get it out there, and potentially recover money for it, or maybe even file for credit cards or other things.
Now, a lot of people believe that they understand it takes a lot of work to solve these complex crimes, but they may not know how much computer forensics is involved in doing this. So, tell us about how you serve a search warrant, the kinds of things that you seize, and of course, some of these things are protected. And how do you get through those protections?
Yeah. So, basically, my responsibility is anything that's capable of holding electronic information, which could be evidence, is really my responsibility. So that's everything. It could be digital cameras, it's cell phones, it's computers, it's servers, it could be Xboxes. It's really anything that's capable of communicating or storing digital information. And really the first thing we do is we look at it in terms of the affidavit, and we see what we can seize, what's the scope of what we can seize, what's the dates between that we can seize. If I find a hard drive in a closet with, an inch of dust on it, does it really have information from the last 2 years in it? Probably not. Now, we'll probably seize it, but we may put that down on the list. In terms of encryption, it's really become...
But a search warrant allows what?
A search warrant allows us to to seize everything, right?
I see.
We can seize everything that's on the attachments of items to be seized, right?
Wow.
Whereas if I had the authority to seize, tax returns or financial documents between 2015 and 2020, an agent at the scene is going to have to look through and pull out the ones that meet the scope of that warrant. But if I'm grabbing an iPad or a phone or whatever, I can't look through individually. I have to take an image of the entire device, right? So that's generally what we'll do on site if we can, is we'll take a forensic image of a device, whether it's an SD card or a laptop or whatever. We'll take a forensic image of it, and then I'll bring that back to my lab, and I'll verify it, make sure that it's hashed properly, it has the right fingerprint on it in terms of making sure that it didn't have any bad sectors when it was copied and whatnot. And then I have to then save that evidence in a way that is legally permissible to use as evidence in federal court, right? I can't just say that I did something. I have to show that I did it and then make it in a reproducible way so that.
Sure, but let me back up. So if you have a search warrant, you don't actually necessarily have to take the computer that's on the desk. You make copies of the drives.
Correct. I can look at the drive. I can look logically or physically at the drive internally, and make an image of it to a government drive, right?
Yes.
And then I can leave the device. Interestingly enough, what a lot of people don't think of is, depending upon what the warrant is for, we may not be allowed to leave those devices, because if it has contraband on it, if there are child exploitation images or discussions of terrorist financing activities or other things that we're investigating, I don't want to just make an image of it and then take my image with me. We may need to seize that device because it actually does have contraband on it. And then if at a later date we want to return it, then we wipe that device. We're not going to give it back with contraband on it. Maybe,
but you don't know if there's contraband.
We don't know.
You examine
we have to look. We have to look. Well,
right.
that's why it really kind of depends on what the investigation is. If it's a
I see.
if it's a PPP loan case or something like that,
You don't need
probably
to
there's
take it.
not,
Yeah,
right?
right.
But if it's a case where, hey, this is a DEA case, we believe this person is involved in, other activities. There are allegations of child exploitation involved. We're not going to leave it. We're going to take it, image it, examine the image, and if there is something that's contraband on it, then we're going to seize that permanently, and or wipe it before we would ever return it.
Understood.
But in terms of the encryption thing, that's really where right now the rubber is really meeting the road, and where we're really almost reaching a limitation in the federal government's ability to do that kind of work. Right now, we're still very capable, but very soon we could be really kind of behind. And what I mean by that is, it's pretty well known that Apple is manufacturing their own chips in the near future. Actually, they're doing it now. And the ability of the federal government and others to be able to break certain encryption schemes could be compromised very quickly. Right now, we can do it for the most part. There are some limitations. iPhones are still very secure. Androids are still pretty secure. And we have some abilities to be able to break into those phones without using, the passcode that is provided by the user or whatnot. But quickly, we could be behind the eight ball, and that's really where the legislative ability of Congress and other places to try to get behind this and say, hey, there's a legitimate reason that we need to be able to look into these devices, and then try to mitigate that, or at least to make sure that we're not overstepping our authority, but also, we're not locking ourselves out permanently.
Mark, can you tell me, you've had a very good, successful career, and it's continuing. What are the elements that made you successful?
I think primarily the first one's probably education. I think, I've taken, obviously, I have an undergraduate degree, but I've taken maybe a dozen or more postgraduate training programs, whether they be certain certifications and training, everything from various types of use of force training to the computer forensic training that I've had over the last number of years, and the certifications that I've developed and have, and I take with me. The education aspect of it is extremely important. And it's not necessarily just in your particular job function. You need to really educate yourself on all fronts, right? Because technology changes. It changes very rapidly. And it becomes extremely important that you keep up your skill set. You can't give up. You can't just say, well, I know enough, right? I'm pretty smart. I know what I need to know. You have to continually challenge yourself to learn more, because if you don't, you're going to get passed by.
Especially in technology.
Especially in technology, and especially with crime, because they're not taking Saturdays and Sundays off, right? They're working all the time to defeat us. And if we don't at least put in an equivalent effort to keep up, we're going to get left behind. And then trying to catch up could be impossible. I think the second thing is curiosity. It was, I've always been a curious person, and we talked earlier about being an auditor and having what's called professional skepticism, and understanding and knowing the difference between what a fact is and whether or not I can prove it are two different things. So that curiosity piece of it is something that if you like solving puzzles and you like being challenged and you like examining things at a deeper level, then this is something that is going to help you, and not just in law enforcement and in computer forensics, but really in anything, right? The curiosity piece is something that really goes a long way in making sure that you'll be successful. And then I think probably the last thing is just is just plain perseverance. It's it's not going to be easy every time. And what I've said to numerous times to people is that if it is easy, or sometimes it starts to feel easy, you're probably not doing it right. Mm-hmm. It should be hard, and you should have to persevere, and you should have to make a significant effort, because if it's easy every time, you're missing something, mm-hmm. right? Mm-hmm. And the perseverance aspect of it, when you go back in history and you see people, even Thomas Edison with a light bulb, and Dr. Bob with machine vision, right? It wasn't easy for you, right?
It takes years.
It takes years and years, and it's easy to give up, mm-hmm. right? It's easy to give up. But what makes someone successful, and I think what makes an industry successful, or what makes a person, or even a hobbyist, right? Someone that's sitting there doing a puzzle, walking away is the easy thing to do, right? Sticking with it and making sure that you finish what you set out to do, and you follow through on it is really what makes, I think, any person successful.
Right. And those traits are very rare, and that's why success is limited to very few people, a small percentage of the world. And I thank you very much for your time, for telling these stories, and thank you much more for spending all these years' effort, brain power in investigating, pursuing these cases that put criminals in jail for stealing our hard-earned money.
You're welcome.
Thanks so much for listening to another episode of Life Lessons with Dr. Bob. If you enjoy these interviews with some of today's most influential thought leaders, please follow and rate the show on your favorite podcast platform. And don't forget, you can also watch each episode on YouTube as well. We'll see you next time.